right, so I want to talk to you about the pumping lemma for context-sensitive languages. We started talking about these things called context-sensitive languages, which generalize context-free languages, and I want to talk about the pumping lemma for these languages. Or not. So it's actually a somewhat open question as to whether there actually exists a pumping lemma for the context-sensitive languages, which is pretty interesting. But I want to give you some heuristics as to why we believe that there is no pumping lemma for context-sensitive languages. Or if there is one, then it doesn't follow the usual convention of what a pumping lemma actually is. So let's try to think about what a pumping lemma should look like. So the proof that I'm going to use is not my own, but it's just so cool that I had to share it. So the credit here goes to someone who posted on the Stack Exchange website. And I'm just going to put his name here, George. I have no idea how to pronounce his last name. Zetsch or something like that. So this is entirely his proof, but I just wanted to share it with all of you because I think it's so cool. So what does it mean to have a pumping lemma? Well, it means that there's some object that is representing this context-sensitive language in this case, and we take some string that is accepted by whatever that thing is. Maybe it's an LBA, maybe it's a context-sensitive grammar, whatever. We take some word that is accepted by that thing, and then we have some kind of computation associated with it that is also in the language of the whatever, the LBA or the grammar or whatever. So, and moreover, this property of whether or not this string is in this language is checkable. So, what does it mean to have a pumping lemma? It means that we have some kind of predicate, using George's terminology, P, where P has three parts. It has a G, a W, and a D. So what do each of these mean? The G means some encoding of the language. And so think here as like an LBA or a context-sensitive grammar or whatever. So it's just some encoding of the type of language that you're dealing with. So like with regular languages, that would be DFA or something like that. Then with context-free languages, that'd be context-free grammar or PDA or something along those lines. And similar idea here. So it's just some encoding. So then the W is what you would expect it to be. It's some string or word, as George's terminology, accepted by the thing. I'll just use thing. That's my word, not his. So then, what is the D parameter? It's some kind of manipulation of the string, and then we can infer other properties of it. So like with a DFA, it'd be like a computation. So in the DFA world, we look at the computation and we saw that there was a loop, and then we can infer other strings that are in the language. Like with context-free grammars, what we had was this parse tree, and then we tried to repeat parts of the parse tree to infer other strings that are also in that language. So this is some kind of pumpable condition, whatever that means. So think of like computation, that's one possibility, or it could be a parse tree, or whatever. It's just some kind of condition that allows us to infer facts about other strings, whether or not they're in the language also. So then one additional property that we want is we want this predicate. If we have the G, we have the W, and we have the D, then we want this condition to be decidable. So we want to be able to, in a finite amount of time, check this so that this is decidable. If it's not decidable, then all bets are off, right? So we've got to make sure that it's decidable. So Another condition is, well, think about how the pumping lemmas for regular and context-free languages went. They went by saying, if we have a string that's long enough, then for all strings longer than that, then we have that property. So then here, the additional property is if W is sufficiently long, then what we have is that there exists some kind of D, some kind of computation, some kind of parse tree, such that the predicate is always true. The predicate is true for this W. So if W is sufficiently long, then I can find a computation or I can find a parse tree for this thing, provided that it's sufficiently long. So then there exists a D such that this predicate holds, G, W, and D. Okay, so provided that it's sufficiently long. Cool. Another thing that we would want to have here is that the language has infinitely many strings in it, because if there aren't infinitely many strings, then this is basically useless, because if it's sufficiently long, then there might not be the predicate actually to be true. So one thing that we can infer from this is that the language is infinite. And that'll actually be a crucial part later. Okay, so then now what are we going to do? So what I'm going to do is, let's suppose that, which we already did above, but I'm just going to rewrite it here. The P, let me write it like this. So this predicate, whatever the three parameters are, is decidable. Then what is the problem that we want to look at? I want to look at this problem. So I'm going to look at the infinity problem of this particular model I'm going to call M, although the name is not really that important. So it's just the encoding of the G's. So the things that are representing the languages, like DFAs, context-free grammars, context-sensitive grammars, LBAs, whatever. And such that the language of this thing is infinite, is recognizable. So this is what I claim. Okay, so I claim that this thing is recognizable if the predicate that we assumed and was a reasonable assumption is decidable. And how does this work? Well, let's think about it. So if we have a sufficiently long string W, then there exists a D, provided that the language of the thing is infinite, such that this property holds. Okay, so then suppose that the G that we're given has an infinite language. Then that means that if this thing has infinite language, then given the string W, whatever it is, provided that it's sufficiently long, then eventually, if I just enumerate all possible D parameters, I can just feed it into this decidable predicate over and over and over, and eventually the predicate is eventually going to say yes, if the language of G is infinite. So, and if the language of G is not infinite, then that enumeration of these D parameters is never going to stop, which is okay, because that G is not in this language, in this infinity set. Okay, so just to recap. So if G's language is infinite, so let's actually write it down. So if the language of G is infinite in size, I'll just abbreviate it like that, then what we can do is enumerate D's when we're given W. Okay, so then we're going to enumerate these this given W until the predicate, whatever the three parameters are, says yes. Well, the problem is, well, the G parameter, the thing that we're given, which is G, there's no W associated with that. So then what we can do is to march in lockstep with the W's. So we can actually enumerate it in the following way, although you don't have to do it this way. So if you have seen the proof of that all rational numbers are countable, think of it, we're going to do a slight variation of that. So let's say that we have the W's, the string W's enumerated in some particular order. So maybe like the empty strings here, 0, 1, etc. And then on the vertical axis, we're going to enumerate we're going to have the D parameters. Okay, so, and of course that may have a totally different representation, but we're going to assume that there's some kind of enumeration of that structure. So whatever that is. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the parameters in this order. Okay, you may think I'm just drawing a long snake, and I really like to, but I'm doing something quite interesting here, which is enumerating all such W and Ds. So no matter what string W you're thinking way out here, and whatever D parameter you're thinking way out here, eventually I'm going to consider it. And the predicate for checking each one of those is decidable by assumption. So that means no matter what square out here that I am considering, I will eventually reach that square. Okay? And the condition says that for all sufficiently large W, if the language is infinite, there exists a D. So if, let's just say that after, I don't know, this point right here, so from here onwards to the right, there always exists a D corresponding to each one of those W's, provided that the language of G is infinite, then eventually we're going to eventually sail north, eventually to find the corresponding D for the W that this column corresponds to. So eventually I'm going to hit that particular D parameter. Okay, and of course every single one of these conditions, these predicate queries, is decidable, and so we will eventually reach that square. However, if the language of G is not infinite, then this will never occur. Okay, so provided that so I'll never find a square where the predicate says true, but that's okay, because all I'm doing here is I'm recognizing whether or not G is in this set at all. So if G is in this set, which means its language is infinite, eventually I'll find the corresponding square for all sufficiently large W. As long as I find one, then that's fine. But eventually I must find it if the language of G is infinite. I know I'm saying it over and over, but it's important that I say this. Okay, so that means that if this predicate is decidable, and we're going to assume this, then as a standard, then that the infinite language corresponding to that particular model, which we encoded by G, is recognizable. Now, I want to show just briefly that the infinity problem, let me spell it right, infinity problem for LBAs, which correspond to context-sensitive languages, is not recognizable. It is not possible to even recognize whether or not an LBA has infinite language or not. Okay, so it's actually a quite simple proof. So we know that the ATM problem, actually no, not ATM. We know that infinite TM is not recognizable either. So the problem of asking whether or not a Turing machine has infinite language is not recognizable. And what I want to do, so this is the claim, I have not proven this. We're going to assume this. And if you don't actually believe me, what you can use is the Strong-Rice's theorem. So if you don't know what that is, search it. I've done a video on it. In fact, I'm probably the only one who has. So there's something called the Strong-Rice theorem, which can prove that certain languages are not recognizable, and this is one of them. Okay. But that doesn't apply here because these are LBAs. It only applies to Turing machines. So I claim that the LBA version is also not recognizable. And why is that the case? So it's actually a very simple proof. So I'm going to go down here and say proof. So then now let's say that we are given a Turing machine, let's call it M, and we're going to be able to recognize the infinity language, provided that we have a recognizer for the LBA version. So we're given a Turing machine M, and I want to figure out whether or not its language is infinite or not. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to build an LBA. So I'm going to build an LBA for a particular language. So what I'm going to build is strings of the form U $V, where M So V is an accepting computation of M on W. And that's it. So, and then what we claim here, actually I should give this a name. Let's call it A, because that's what George used. So then what I claim here is that the A is infinite if and only if the language of the original Turing machine has infinite size. And why is this? So, and actually I should claim that an LBA can do this. Well, but first off, this statement. So if A is infinite, that means that there are infinitely many strings. There's only one computation, one accepting computation, because it's just a normal Turing machine. So that means that there are infinitely many strings that M accepts. Oh, actually I should say U here. That was my mistake. U. So there are infinitely many strings that M has accepted here because there's only one possible V for every W. So then if the language of M is infinite, then that means there are infinitely many U's that are in this thing, and then that means there corresponds to it a V corresponding to it. So this statement is true. So then why can an LBA do this? Well, so V itself, we're assuming, is the entire accepting computation of M on W. So if we think about what that encodes, this is actually very similar to the proof that the emptiness problem for Turing machines is undecidable, but I'm going to redo it anyway. So what does V encode? Well, it depends, but we can say that it's something like C0, C1, C2, etc. up to Cm, let's say. And where each of these is a configuration of the Turing machine along the way. So what the LBA has to do is figure out that C0 in one transition yields C1, C1 yields C2, etc. up to Cm. And it can do that because all it needs to do is just check the adjacent configurations. It also needs to check that this one on the left is the starting configuration corresponding to the U string, but we're given that as input, and that this thing contains QAccept. So QAccept is somewhere over here, but that's pretty easy to check. Okay, so an LBA can do this, and so if there's a recognizer to check whether or not this set is infinite, which corresponds to an LBA, then that means that we have answered whether, as a recognizer, whether or not a Turing machine has infinite language or not. But that's unrecognizable by Strong-Rice's theorem, and so the infinity problem for LBAs therefore is not recognizable, and so therefore there must not exist a pumping lemma for context-sensitive languages. Whew. All right, so that was quite an interesting proof. It involves a lot of technical details, but is really profound and actually gets to the heart of how Turing machines and context-sensitive languages and LBAs work. I think it's just super awesome. So hopefully that was interesting. Leave thoughts down below about context-sensitive languages and pumping lemmas. As always, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. There are many other links in the video description if you want to support the channel further. And if you want to see more like this, please subscribe. And as always, I'll see you next time.